Well, hello my friends. Welcome to my video about a word we call attribution and dropped quotes. Hopefully you remember those terms from English 1010, but if not, I'm going to refresh your memory just a bit. So if you want to follow along with me, please go to content up at the top of our Brightspace course page. And once you get there, click on course documents. And the first little document that we'll look at is entitled Attribution Verbs Handout. And you'll find it under Attribution. So if you remember that word from English 1010, hopefully your instructor taught you about it. When we attribute something to someone, obviously we are giving that person credit for having originated those words or those thoughts or those ideas. We're attributing that quote or those words that we've paraphrased, put into our own language to someone else. And so that's what we're doing with that word attribution. And so we want to avoid dropping a quote in our writing because that causes you point deductions, that causes your grade to plummet for that paper. And what we mean by avoiding dropped quotes is we want to integrate the quote into a sentence structure of our own. So the golden rule is any quote that appears in your essay all by itself as a sentence is a dropped quote. You must incorporate it, integrate it in some way into your own sentence. So that's the rule. And the easiest way to do that is with what we call attribution or signal words. And they're almost always verbs. And that's why you see attribution verbs also called signal words if you're following along with me with this first document. So I give you in this document different kinds of attribution verbs that you can use to help you introduce a quote. And I've categorized them according to what sort of source you might have. So let's say you are writing a paper and your source is neutral. So in other words, it isn't really strongly expressing a view either for or against something. It's just kind of neutral. It's just commenting on an idea, or maybe it's commenting on a piece of literature, and you want to use that source to back up your claim about a piece of literature that you're writing about in this class. You could use an attribution verb like comments, observes, says. That's the weakest of all of them. If you can avoid says, that's really a good thing to do. But that is a neutral sort of attribution word that you could use. Describes, points out, etc. And so I could say literary critic Clive Austen comments that A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor is a riveting text, right? And so if his direct wording was A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor is a riveting text, I would put that in quotation marks. And I have thus incorporated that quote into my own sentence. And at the end of it, of course, I would have to cite it with Austen and the page number from the source. If the source is kind of inferring something or suggesting something, but it doesn't come right out and strongly say so, it's just sort of suggestive of an idea, you can use an attribution verb like analyzes or ask. Maybe the source is posing a question, assesses, concludes, considers, etc. If the source is arguing, so maybe arguing a point really strongly or arguing with someone who disagrees, you could use a stronger attribution verb like alleges or claims or contends or insists or maintains or argues. So Clive Austen argues that Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find is a riveting text, and then maybe I have a direct quote from him in which he's arguing that point. If the source is agreeing with someone else or something else, you could have an attribution verb like admits, agrees, agrees, concedes. So that's sort of like, I'm going to give you this. I'll admit you're right about this. Concurs, grants, allows. But if the source is uneasy and disagreeing, then you could use an attribution verb like complains or deplores or laments or warns, or disagrees. So use these verbs rather than says. Don't just say so-and-so says, quote, citation. That's very boring. When you use an attribution verb, you're showing your reader how the source that you're quoting feels about what he or she is saying. And in your attribution, it's a good idea to tell your reader the first time you're using a source who this person is, maybe what his or her credentials are. Clive Austen, a famous literary critic, comments that Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find is, quote unquote, a riveting text, right? So remember these attribution verbs, also called signal words or signal verbs, because they're signaling to your reader that you are about to give the reader a quote. Use these to introduce the quote and avoid dropping the quote. So that's attribution. Now if you want to go back to the course documents and click on dropped quotes info and exercises for students, we can go into this idea of how to avoid dropped quotes a little bit more intricately. So why is it important to avoid dropped quotes in your writing? Why does it matter? Well, a dropped quotation, a quote that appears in a paper without any introduction, it's just there as a sentence by itself, disrupts the flow of thought. It creates an abrupt change in voice and tone, and it may leave the reader wondering, well, why did you even include this quote? And often students in 1010 will do it because the professor has said, you need to quote at least twice in this paper, or you need to quote 5 times in this paper. So the writer is new to college writing and unskilled at that point in time, and just pulling quotes from out of thin air and not connecting them in any way and not explaining to the reader why the quote is included. You always want to have a reasoning behind why you're including a quote. You don't just throw it in to throw it in. You include it in order to help support an idea that you're making. So instead of creating this unwelcome disruption in your paper's cohesiveness with a dropped quote, if you're a skilled writer, a thoughtful writer, you're going to employ strategies to smoothly integrate the source material that you're quoting from into your own writing. So what are the benefits of doing that? Well, when you smoothly incorporate a quote, you can then strategically introduce your reader to a new speaker. You can connect that source's point to the theme of the quote. You can provide your audience with a clear sense of how the quote is supporting your own ideas, right? And using those tactics to segue from your voice to the source's voice adds agency, and it adds authority to your ideas. In other words, it gives you ethos. It sets up your credibility as a writer and a thinker. So how do you do this? How do you integrate a direct quote into your paper smoothly and fluently? Well, you use what we call signal words, signal phrases, or attribution words or verbs or phrases. And you can use them at the beginning or at the end of your quote. Usually at the beginning is going to create a better flow with your writing. So here are some sample signal phrases or attribution phrases. Noted journalist John Doe proposed that, quote, so here within the quotes we're using John Doe's own words, and then at the end of it, in parentheses, we have the page number from where we took the quote, 14. So notice I don't have to include the author's last name, Doe, in my in-text citation, my parenthetical or in-text citation, because I've mentioned the writer's name in my attribution, noted journalist John Doe. And note that my period comes after my last parenthesis mark in MLA, because that is now the end of my sentence. My sentence doesn't end at the end of John Doe's quote there, where the quotation mark is at the end. No, my sentence is going on because I'm including an in-text citation. So my sentence ends after that citation, after that last closing parenthesis mark. get that in your head and you will not go wrong. Now, if I had not mentioned the author's name in my attribution, if I had just said a noted journalist proposed that, quote, unquote, then in parenthesis, I would have had to have put Doe 14, end parenthesis, period. I would not put a comma between the author's last name and the page number in MLA. I would not do it. That doesn't happen. Here's another example. Experts from the Centers for Disease Control advise citizens to, and then you quote the actual wording from this source. And then in parentheses, you place the author, and in this case, it's a collective author, CDC, Center for Disease Control. And there's not a page number in this case. That's probably because the writer found this particular source, this quote, online, and there was no page number. But again, the period goes after the last parenthesis mark. And then the last example there is an example of putting the attribution at the end of the quote. So beginning the sentence with a quote. So quote, suggested researcher Jane Doe, and then I still have to cite it because I'm using Jane Doe's words. Even if I put her words into my words and I paraphrase what she said, I still have to cite at the end because she originated those ideas, right? So you want to use an informative sentence to introduce your quotation. And we saw in the first examples there how if you tell your reader the first time you're quoting from a source who the person is, noted journalist, an expert, a researcher, right, a literary critic, whoever it is, that's going to help establish your ethos and connect to your ideas. Because the reader is not a mind reader. The reader doesn't know who John Doe or Jane Doe are unless you tell them. You can use an informative sentence to introduce the quote. So here are some sample introductory sentences. The results of dietitian Sally Smith's research counter the popular misconception that a vegan diet is nutritionally incomplete, colon. And then you would have the quote from Sally Smith, and then in parentheses you would have the page number. You wouldn't have to list Smith because you've already listed her name in your attribution. So your reader knows Sally Smith is a dietitian, so she's knowledgeable in this field. We know that she's someone who did research from that attribution there, and we know how she feels about the research, that it counters this popular misconception that people have that a vegan diet doesn't give you the full nutrition that you need. And as a vegan, I can tell you, it does give you the nutrition that you need if you're doing it correctly. So I'll just put in a plug there for becoming a vegan. When I became a vegan and began working out every single day of the world, I instantly dropped 45 pounds. And I have to tell you that I would never go back, ever. I feel 150% better, have a lot more energy, and so I'm a big believer there. And then here's another example. An experiment conducted by Dave Brown indicates that texting while driving is more dangerous than previously believed, colon. Now, that attribution didn't tell us Dave Brown's credentials, did not tell us who he is, whether he's an expert in the field of, researching texting while driving. We don't really know his credentials. So you could include that and set up your ethos as a writer even more strongly. But this still works in terms of introducing the quote smoothly. Now, the colon method. See how you have the colons there, and then you would have the quote, the direct words from the source, either Sally Smith or Dave Brown, and then in parentheses after the quote, you would have the page number, into parenthesis, period, right? So when can you use that colon method? Here's when. When your introduction to the quote, before the quote, forms a complete sentence, an independent clause that has a subject, that has a verb, that makes complete sense within itself, that could stand alone as a sentence, then you can put a colon after it and incorporate that quote. But notice if I had put a period after the word incomplete in the first example there, or after the word believed in the second one, and then the quote, I would have a dropped quote because the quotes would then be appearing all by themselves as a sentence. That colon makes the quote part of my sentence, and I can use it because my wording before the quote constitutes a complete sentence. If it did not, I would have to use a comma. So, again, you have a listing here of some signal verbs that are all good ones to use. They're all better than says. Says just falls flat. And so then you have a few exercises that you can do. So you would read through each passage and determine whether or not it effectively integrates a direct quote. And this is normally something that we would do together in class and discuss it right afterwards. So public schools regularly test students' progress in the areas of reading, math, and science in elementary and middle school. But high school students are only required to test one time in 10th grade, period. And then we have this quote. For many students, the consequences of this neglect come quickly. 1/3 of students attending four-year colleges and nearly 2/3 of those attending two-year colleges are required to take remedial courses, unquote. And then in parentheses, the writer's last name, Carrie, the page number from which her quote came, 50, in parentheses and period. So now, did that passage effectively integrate that quote from Carrie, or is that quote from Carrie a dropped quote? How do I know? Remember the golden rule. If a quote appears all by itself as a sentence in my paper or in anyone else's paper, it is a dropped quote. Well, does that quote from Carrie appear all by itself as a sentence? Is there a period before it? And then it's all by itself standing alone as a sentence? Yes. So is it a dropped quote? Yep. So how could I fix it? Well, because the sentence before the quote is a complete one, it's an independent clause. If I turn that period after the words 10th grade into a colon, presto changeo, I've incorporated the quote and avoided dropping it, okay? But the in-text citation at the end of it is done correctly. There's no comma between Carrie and 50, and the period is happening in the right place. Look at number 2. While public universities within the United States have standardized requirements, I sound like Barbara Wawa again, requirements, when it comes to the number of credit hours students must complete to earn similar degrees, there is little consistency when it comes to the content of the courses they must take. Basically, quote, every institution grants the same 2 or 4 year credentials that signify little more than how many hours the bearer sat in classrooms, unquote. And then you have the in-text citation, the author's last name, the page number, end parentheses, period. So that part's done correctly. But is it integrated effectively? Okay, it's kind of integrated, right? Because you've got the word basically. So the quote isn't appearing all by itself as a sentence. The writer has included one word. But is it effectively integrated? Not really. We need more than just basically, right? We need a better connecting thought than that. Then look at number 3. As Carrie points out, the United States education system is falling behind that of other countries, especially when it comes to higher education, colon. And then we have that quote about the data, and then we have the in-text citation, Carrie 49. So, is the quote integrated effectively? Does it appear all by itself as a sentence? Is there a period after the word education, just before the quote? No, there's a colon. So guess what? It is integrated into the writer's own sentence. It is not a dropped quote. And it's integrated well because we know what Carrie's argument is here, how Carrie feels about it, what the view of the writer is, etc. And then number 4, in order to ensure that incoming freshmen succeed as college students, high schools need to better prepare students for the demands of college courses. As Carrie puts it, quote, the key to helping those students and all students is to erase the arbitrary and damaging dividing line between high school and college, unquote. And then 51. So does the quote appear all by itself as a sentence? No. We have some of the writer's own words, as Carrie puts it, right? And we do have the page number at the end. And then the last one, since economists predict that in 2018 there will be more jobs requiring higher degrees than there will be people with college educations, quote, helping new generations of Americans graduate from college will be crucial to the nature's future prosperity. And then we have the writer's last name and the page number. So does the quote appear by itself as a sentence? No, it's incorporated into the writer's own writing. Let me ask you this. Why do you think that lowercase h in the first word of the quote, helping, is bracketed? Why is it placed in brackets? So I hope you learned this in 1010. Because those brackets indicate that the writer changed that one little letter, right? So if you need to change a letter or one or two words in a quote, put the changed letter or words in brackets to indicate to your reader you changed this one little thing. Well, why do you think that this writer might have changed that lowercase or done something different here with the word helping and the letter H in the beginning of helping? Probably because in the original quote from Carrie, that was a sentence unto itself with a capital H, an uppercase H. And this writer changed that uppercase H to a lowercase h to allow it to fit in smoothly and grammatically and correctly into his or her own sentence structure. So if you need to do that, so for example, another example of using that bracketing technique would be where maybe you have a quote that is from a short story or a poem talking about a particular character, and the quote uses the word he or she. He turned to the girl and said, blah, 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 right? And those words are part of the text. But you're afraid your reader might not understand to whom that pronoun he is referring. So you could bracket, and instead of he, put the American turns to the girl and says, right? So your reader becomes clear then to whom that pronoun is referring. So that's another example of when you might use the bracketing technique to change a word or two or a letter or two. So I hope that this is helpful. It will be really important for you to avoid dropped quotes and to use attribution, to use those signal words and phrases to incorporate your quotes as you're writing your papers this semester. Thanks for listening.